It would be useful for us to make decisions about whether we wanted to focus on what we saw already as an area of strength, or whether we'd rather begin with an area that we felt needed some development. Or maybe we might have a strong interest as a team that we might want to use the early years learning framework as an opportunity to really run with that interest. So I think it just depends, but I'd certainly start with talking with the team that I was part of as to what we wanted to get out of it, and a place that we felt comfortable starting with, because I think feeling comfortable is a really important starting point. And then it depends on how much confidence people feel that they have as a team in terms of how many risks they'd like to start taking, how early on they'd like to take the risks, or whether they'd like to start with something that they just feel more confident and comfortable with.
There's many different ways that people can use the document, so there would be many different starting points really. So you could start with the pedagogical principles, you could start with the 3 Bs, the belonging, being and becoming. You could start with the learning outcomes. I think it's important to get an overview of the whole document and to not just pull out the learning outcomes in isolation from the very important principles and practices that underpin the document. You could pull out one particular aspect like play and talk about that with staff, talk about that across centres with other staff. So I think there's many different starting points. You could also look at mapping your existing practices to the early years learning framework, map the New South Wales curriculum framework to the early years learning framework to look at where there's similarities and where there are areas that you think you might need to become more familiar or do more work to focus on that particular aspect. You could look at existing methods of documentation and look at how you might link those with the early years learning framework. So it's not about, you know, developing new processes or documents, but looking at how you might adapt the documents that you currently use to perhaps more clearly articulate the principles and pedagogies and learning outcomes of the early years learning framework.
The document is going to be used in so many different contexts. So I could say to you, as a teacher in a long day care centre, I use the document by, I guess, picking out the bits that are interesting to me. For example, there's a page in the early years learning framework that talks about all the different kinds of theories that we might use to think through our practice. So that's one thing that I would engage with in my teaching. I'm also really interested in the concepts of belongings and becomings, and I like to work with those and theories that talk about becomings and belongings in my everyday teaching. So then if you ask me that question in the work I do at university level, I guess it's asking early childhood professionals and children's services professionals to think through, what does this document mean for you? To think through, you know, what ideas are in there that are new to you, or what things are in there that you want to debate or puzzle through or reconceptualise through your own work. So then if I think about how I'd use the document in my consultancy work, I think it's a great opportunity to sit with educators and unpack certain parts of the document, pick out a quote. What does that mean to you? Is this how you talk about your practice? Is this a new way? Is it something you hadn't thought of before? Or are there things you need to add to it? I think one of the exciting parts of the early years learning framework is at the end of each outcome it says add your own. So it's a clear invitation to say, here's some big ideas about early childhood and children's services. What are yours? Add them in, write them into this document in order to make it your own.
The notion of intentional teaching, and begin to work with staff around what they think that means. Because I think that would be a provocative place to start. So that's one way. I think the principles are clearly probably a softer entry into it. And I think another possibility is to work with images of the child, images of children, images of childhood, and to work through what that means for children in their years before school, and to go back to that intentional teaching, take on the idea of images of the early childhood educator.
There are lots of good ways to start, and even though particular services and particular educators might be wedded to a particular way of starting, I think you know, the experience in the trial sites and just common sense would say that there are lots of different ways to start. I think one way to start, particularly if there's some resistance from people or a bit of panic or skepticism, is to start small and start specific, and maybe start with a strength. Start with an area where you think your practices are pretty good, and it might be in the area of literacy. It might be your outdoor environment. It could be anything that you think you're doing pretty well in, and use the framework to kind of match up with what you're doing. Some people want to start really broadly with a particular principle. For example, looking at the whole area of partnerships with families, and looking at all of their practices and all of their communications. You could narrow that down a little bit and say you're just going to look, for example, at the written material you provide for parents, and kind of critique that, looking at the extent to which it conveys the idea of partnership. Another obvious area is to start with an area that you know needs improvement. It could be anything. It could be large or small. But I also think that it's probably, once you're familiar with the document, it's probably better to start with something real in your service that you're interested in looking at, or that you need to look at, and then look at the framework. I mean, given familiarity before you start, rather than saying, okay, let's take this section of the framework and see how it applies to our service. I think that could be a little bit vague and a little bit too general. Some specific examples from services that I know of: a family daycare scheme that looked at the play sessions, the play groups that they offer for carers and children, and over a period of several months took a specific learning outcome and thought a lot about the opportunities and experiences and interactions they were offering children related to that particular outcome. And so they were able to use the play session both as a time to model good practices with children for carers, and also to talk with carers about what they were doing. So that worked really well. A childcare centre that I heard of that decided they were going to look at their routines with children under 2, particularly lunchtime and resting and sleeping, but all of the routines with the aim of checking out the opportunities that babies and toddlers had to use initiative, to use that sense of agency that's talked about in the framework, the extent to which children, not so much independence and autonomy, but the extent to which very young children had chances to initiate, to start something and be responded to. A preschool that was in the process of planning some renovations for their outdoor play area. And initially their aim was to just make it more interesting, more good stuff for children to do outside. But after engaging with the ELF, they decided that they would also like to look at what opportunities they could build into the outdoor play area that would encourage children to develop that sense of caring for the natural environment, learning about the natural environment, issues around sustainability, those sorts of issues related to you know, awareness of the natural world. So it kind of reoriented something that they were already in the process of doing. Another service that, just a very simple thing, but it was quite effective, used the 3 Bs, the belonging, being and becoming, to put a display on the notice board in the foyer for families, and they just very few key words, but lots of photographs and some documentation of children's work to kind of illustrate those notions and begin to engage with families about the framework.